Wow, you guys stayed. Everybody at my table was leaving, so I'm impressed. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from MDE, MDA, and others that assembled this group. It's great to be having this discussion. I will tell you, we've been having this discussion since 2002. So it is time we either decide we're going to do it or not. And I'm here to tell you I'm tired of talking. And I did tell somebody that is involved with water quality trading policy that if I were still talking about this 10 years from now, please shoot me, and it's been over 10 years. He doesn't have any bullets in the gun, thank goodness. But the other thing is trading. We talk about trading. How do we define this? And I think it scares a lot of people when you start using this market jargon. And I would suggest to you, really what we're talking about here, my way of thinking, is that we're looking at cost-effective ways and flexible ways to reduce nutrient load and sediment loadings. That's really what we're talking about. We don't have enough money to do all the things we need to do, and we're really trying to say, how can we be more effective and efficient at doing this? And is there flexibility in the way we do this? And then the other side of it is we're talking about a Bay TMDL, and I know there's been a lot of questions about the fact that you might leave hot spots, but I think the issue is what's driving this is the overall Bay TMDL. We know there are local TMDLs, but it's the Bay TMDL that's driving it, and really the system should reflect a Bay-wide approach. So with that, I'll give you a brief elevator speech about resource environmental solutions. I was the founder of a group called Environmental Bank and Exchange, located and headquartered here in Maryland. We got acquired in December of 2014 by a company called Resource Environmental Solutions. We're now one of the largest ecological offset providers in the country. We have operations in over 9 states. 110 mitigation sites, about 425 conservation easements, 32,000 acres of restored wetlands, 165 miles of stream restoration. And here's one that, you know, we're going to be talking a little bit about more, over 240 tons of nitrogen and phosphorus reduction. So we've been in other markets. I think it's helpful to hear. I'll try to give you some examples of what I think has worked in those markets when we get there. So with that in mind, I want to come back to this notion of trading, and it's not a monolithic point. To my way of thinking, there are really 4 types of markets that we need to consider, and each one is different. So one is the annual compliance for wastewater treatment plants, and in Maryland right now, that's not an eligible market opportunity because we use the Bay Restoration Fund to basically upgrade our 67 wastewater treatment plants. So that really isn't a market opportunity. It may be in the future. For example, in Pennsylvania, that is entirely their market. So you got to understand it really looks different. It's an annual practice-based approach, and it is focused towards wastewater treatment plants. The second market is credits for new or expanded NPDES discharges. And that's a scenario that Maryland, and we'll talk a little bit more about the policy, but Maryland has kind of had a de facto policy saying if we're going to do this, we need at least 10 years of credits. And that looks different from the annual market because then you're looking at creating practices that are over 10 years. So then you may do more structural practices than you might do annual practices. Then the third market is offsets for stormwater. That's new growth. And in the Watershed Implementation Plan, basically there isn't any element for new growth. So the idea is any new growth that triggers new nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment discharges is going to drive an offset requirement. And that looks more permanent. And that's, so places like Virginia and North Carolina have had this market. And so that looks very different. And then finally, it's the MS4 market, which is the 10 jurisdictions in Maryland. And there you're looking at probably, although these are yet to be concluded, but it's typically a permanent solution. But you're looking to restore an additional 20% of the jurisdiction's impervious areas. And so there's an impervious acre currency that you're looking to try to achieve And Shannon Moore kind of gave you a little bit of a backdrop on that and how Frederick County is looking at it. So again, when you're thinking about markets, make sure that we're looking at it with these lenses and understanding their different contexts. So let's talk about the potential role of third parties, and that's really the topic of my discussion, the role of brokers and aggregators. In this slide, it shows basically you could have a scenario where the sellers are farmers or independent landowners that sell directly to the buyers. And there's nothing to stop that, and that should be a big part of the system. It tends to be a bit more problematic because there are certification requirements, there are capital requirements, and other types of issues that really become problematic in doing that. In addition, the buyer wants to know if there's a default, and I'm going to go after the individual that's selling, do I want to go sue a farmer? And so there's those elements as well, and that create some barriers to that kind of scenario. The second scenario is really a broker dynamic, and that's a situation where a broker is mainly a matchmaker. So the broker isn't taking a principal role in the project. They're just basically matching the buyer and the seller. And that only works where there's a very liquid market that has high volume. So to the extent that they're nominal trades, the role of a broker is fairly limited. And then the third dynamic is an aggregator. And the aggregator is basically plays a role of a principal in the project, which means they are taking on the legal responsibility for delivery. And they're typically looking at dealing with a bunch of farms. So you're building a portfolio of farms. And it may not just be farms. I'm using farms as the example because we could have urban types of practices that also yield credits. But you're assembling a series of potential projects into one portfolio, and you're taking legal responsibility for the success of that. And we'll get into more specifically the roles. Then you're selling to the buyer, and you're on the line legally for the success of the performance criteria set out on that. The final dynamic is a clearinghouse central exchange, and that's done in Pennsylvania. Penvest basically is the clearinghouse for credits, where the state is basically taking on the legal risk associated with that. And that is one that takes a lot of infrastructure. It's costly. And again, there has to be a fair volume and liquidity in the marketplace to even warrant that kind of scenario. So let's come back to the role of aggregator and kind of walk through some of the dynamics that we're really talking about. First, there may be rules on aggregators, meaning do you have to be certified? Do you have to have financial assurances? Are there capital requirements? Those kind of things. To date, there hasn't been any of that suggested in Maryland, but it could be, and that's just something you've got to be aware of. The understanding the basic market factors, and I think we have had some discussions here. Just because there's trading, it doesn't mean it's going to be done. What we mean by this is the market factors is, hey, if I do a trade, what's the cost of my pound of reduction of nitrogen? And how does that jibe with somebody doing a nitrogen reduction themselves? Because again, what we're really talking about is trading is a tool. It's not the end all. So if somebody could comply themselves cheaply through technological approaches, they would do that. And so you have to understand those dynamics in terms of the market. The third point, undertaking baseline analysis of both the market and technical viability. And you're going to hear probably more from Susan Payne that follows me a little bit about baseline. But baseline's a very, very important issue in order to participate. It's not only for the buyer, but also the seller. So if I'm a farmer, I may have a baseline allocation in my WIP that tells me what my loading factor is, and I've got to have a requirement that I have a nutrient management plan and a soil conservation water quality plan in place, and I've got to be compliant with those plans in order to sell. And I can tell you there are a lot of farms that don't meet those criteria. But you've got to understand that baseline, and the other side is understand whether that baseline is high or low, because if it takes a lot to get the baseline, that means your credits are going to be expensive because you have to pay to get the baseline before you can even generate a credit. So again, the concept of credit generation only occurs after you achieve baseline, and you only get credit for anything above the reductions below, your baseline requirements. Certification of credits, and again, I think you're going to hear more from Susan on this, but it's not a small matter. It takes a lot of time and effort to get individual projects certified, particularly under the current approach in Maryland. And it is not easy. It's not a lookup table. It's not a very clear calculation. It's a nutrient trading tool done at the farm level. Sales transaction. Okay, when we talk about buyer and seller, we're talking about that buyer and basically entering into a contract with the seller, and that includes things like financial assurances, default mechanisms, and the like. Because if I'm a buyer, remember what you heard from EPA today was we're not going to absolve that permittee from responsibility. They can contractually get somebody else to be held accountable, but EPA is first going to come to the permittee, and then that permittee would have to come to the individual seller to say, okay, you didn't deliver, I'm on the line, how are you going to rectify this default? So no small matter on that. Then trading contracts. So the idea is, okay, a buyer and seller have agreed, but the MDE is going to have to agree that this is eligible to be put in a permit. So then you're going to have to perhaps work with the MDE and interface with that group on making sure you got a compliance schedule on how you're getting the credits put into the permit context. Then we're talking about funding and managing the projects. Again, the early stage funding goes right at the certification process. It has taken up to about 3 to 4 months here in Maryland for some of the farms that were test cases, and it takes money to do that. In addition to basically installing the practices, because one of the things you'll hear about in Maryland is you have to install the practice before you can be fully certified. So how you fund that is going to be an important element, and the role of an aggregator typically helps smooth those issues. Assume and manage risk. We talked about that in the contractual context. Managing a diverse portfolio of credits. As I talked to you about those 4 different types of markets, one of the things I think is, again, important, you may have different types of practices. So you may have an annual practice, cover crops are an annual practice. You may have a structural practice, such as riparian buffers. And you may have agronomic practices, precision agriculture that Trey Hill mentioned earlier. That's an agronomic type practice. Those are all different practices that can generate credits, but they have different time periods associated with them. So you're going to have these blended portfolio of those kind of credits and understand how they're going to be managed in a portfolio context. The other thing is potential integration with other environmental markets. I mean, you heard some discussion about the opportunity for mitigation. You might be able to leverage mitigation in addition to nutrient reduction projects so that you're achieving scale. And then finally, ensuring those projects. The issue is most aggregators are going to be in a position to have to self-insure, and then over time you insure through a portfolio approach on the project side. So give you a few examples, and I think this is important to talk about, we've been working actively in North Carolina since 2005, actually, but been developing banks since about 2007, 2008. And we've been in Virginia for a number of years as well. Both of those are stormwater offset markets. And again, I gave you that context. So remember, stormwater offsets is a permanent market. They both require that there be a permanent easement associated with the development of these offsets. And both are really focused on one practice, so you don't have multiple practices, and that's tree planting. And in North Carolina, it's very interesting to see this because it teaches you a lot. In North Carolina, they have a very simple model. You plant an acre of trees, you reduce 2,273 pounds of nitrogen. They give you that information. That's what it is. You know what it is. There's no baseline requirements. You basically go out and plant your trees, put your easement in place, go through an approval process, and create what's called a bank, a nutrient bank in advance of the impact so that you can sell over time. And we've sold over 200 tons of nutrient credits in that marketplace. The interesting thing about North Carolina is if you do a practice, you can sell both the nitrogen and the phosphorus separately. So one practice may yield both, but you can sell both. And a lot of this gets to the level of basically the developer. We've got churches, development groups, Duke Energy, others who are buyers. So it's not just big buyers, it's anyone that's grading. And it's primarily in the Neuse River watershed and the Cape Fear, and this is driven by state law. So state law is driven. This is not a TMDL dynamic. Virginia also is a state law dynamic, and there's a scenario where tree planting has been the practice as well. And in that context, Virginia is very much interested only in phosphorus. So they require a permanent easement. They basically say and then they have a lookup table, and you basically know where you are. Are you east of 95, west of 95? Am I converting from hay to forest? And if I'm doing that, I've got a lookup table that tells me how many credits I get. And it's pretty darn simple. And then ultimately, there's an approval process that you go through on that as well. But if you sell your phosphorus, you have to retire your nitrogen, so they don't allow you to sell those separately. And that's been evolving, and we've got over 3 banks in that context working with folks like Virginia Department of Transportation. I think the theme on both of these is tremendous simplicity. Not a lot of complications, very limited practices, and a really good understanding of the approval process. And they work in that context. So let's come back to Maryland and talk about kind of the backdrop of where we sit today. And as I mentioned, in 2005, the Bay Restoration Fund created a flush tax that basically said we're going to technologically upgrade all of our wastewater treatment plants, and we're not going to use trading to achieve those objectives. So trading's been out of the game on that issue, unlike the state of Pennsylvania. But then in 2008, Maryland came up with draft policies to talk about point source to point source trading. And the idea there was, hey, what happens if a wastewater treatment plant retires? Can they sell credits to somebody that could pick up those credits in the same watershed? And so there was a set of rules that define that context. And then also in 2008, there were draft guidelines, what we called Phase 2, which was the non-point source to point source scenario. And that's been around in draft form since April of 2008 and has never been finalized. And that is what led to this nutrient trading tool, the baseline dynamics, the things that resulted in the Maryland Department of the Ag regulations really stemmed from this initial draft set of guidelines. They've been tweaked, but again, that was kind of the premise. Then in 2012, 2013, there was an accounting for growth work group. It's now called Alignment for Growth, but that dealt with stormwater offsets. So again, remember the 4 markets. And that was a construct of looking at how do you offset for new growth. We had a gubernatorial election that slowed that process down, and that's going to be picked up again because there's got to be a set of rules relating to that. And then with the new administration, Secretary Grumbles very quickly came out with a policy on water quality trading, which is fantastic. And some of the points there is, yes, indeed, we think cross-sector trading between agriculture and urban should be allowed. We're talking about 3 geographic service areas. And again, this is policy probably to continue to be tweaked. We think there's a really strong role for the private sector, and we think there's a need to develop a comprehensive trading policy. So that came out in October of 2015. And then, as you heard earlier, in December 28th of 2015, the MDA then has issued their regulations on certification of ag credits. And I'll walk you through a little bit of some of the points from my perspective, because I think it's important we all understand kind of where we're heading on that. But that's for agricultural nutrient and sediment credit certification. So let's jump into that. And I think it's really a huge step for the state. It's a beginning step, but I think it's important to understand this really only relates to ag certification. It doesn't relate to urban certification, and it doesn't tell you how you can use them, meaning we still need these trading policies about, okay, I certify a credit, how do I use them and where do I use them? So that's still to come. But the idea of, they set the eligibility. We talked about baseline. We talked about the fact that you have to have a nutrient management plan and a soil water quality plan in place. Here's a really interesting thing. They don't want to see whole or substantial portions of farmland, productive farmland, idle. So unlike Virginia, where you could plant trees and basically plant them entirely in the ag area, that can't be done in Maryland, and it's going to be, it's not result in idling of whole or substantial, and that's got to be defined over time. Credit generation, we talked a little bit about this, the fact that if you have cost share practices, they're not going to be eligible to generate credits, but they could be eligible to get you up to baseline. Now, if you did have a practice, for example, like a CREP practice that expired after 10 years and you decided to extend that, well, then that would be eligible. So there are those opportunities there. Types of practices. Remember, I mentioned in Virginia and North Carolina, planting trees was basically it. There are a host of practices in the state of Maryland, and they're categorized as Category 1, 2, and 3. Category 1 is the one that's basically been vetted by the Bay model and accepted. So those are the ones that you don't have to go through independent scientific review in order to get the practices accepted. And there are a host of them. Some are structural, some are agronomic, and you really have to know the efficiencies associated with those. And then we talk about lifespan. I think this is a really important point as well. If I plant trees, how long do I get credit for those trees? Is it 20 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 30 years? Those are really important issues. So the lifespan of credits is also part of the regs. But one of the things that the regs say is you do not generate a credit until you install the practice. And if you install it, let's say in December or September, you wouldn't get credit until January 1 of the following year. Doesn't mean you couldn't enter into a contract with a buyer before that, but it does suggest that in order to be certified as a credit, you have to have it installed, and that costs capital. Certification process, as I mentioned, there's kind of you're going to go through this, and Susan, again, is going to give you more detail on this, but the idea of having the nutrient trading tool in place, it is not a very simple thing. You've got to get all the nutrient management plans, all the applicable plans, all the practices already put in the field, and really try to tweak that under the tool. And then MDA comes out and pre-certifies, and then ultimately you go through the certification and registration. Verification is really important for the marketplace, and the idea of having an independent verifier is built into the regs, which I think is really a good thing. In terms of trading approval, again, as I mentioned to you earlier, these regs only address how to certify an ag credit. Doesn't tell you, well, does that mean MDE is going to accept these credits in a trading dynamic? MDE you're going to have to go separately. So these regs don't address that. And so policy statements and other things have to follow on that. Trading geographies, again, as I mentioned, there's the water quality policy statement that talks about 3 geographies. That is out there right now. Whether that gets put in place specifically is a big issue. Duration of trades, as again, I mentioned those 4 types of markets. Each market may be different. You may have an annual, you may have a 10-year, you may have a permanent trade, depending on what market you're in. And then enforcement is also built in that. A couple other points on this accounting for growth. So I'm switching from the ag certification to this idea of stormwater offsets. And just a couple points, because that work group convened in 2012 and 2013. There were a lot of points raised that have to be revisited, and they're being revisited as we speak. But I thought it was kind of important to kind of raise these just so you have an understanding on that market. When you talk about effective date, one of the interesting things is this is going to be implemented by the counties, and it's basically going to be a grading permit. So anytime anybody does building, it's going to trigger that requirement, and that is the threshold trigger. And if you have excess loadings beyond your pre-development load, then you're going to have to offset those. That's the driver. And they're looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, but although nitrogen's the primary constituent. The interesting thing about stormwater loading factors, and I think Rich mentioned it earlier, you can get into dynamics where when you take into account edge of field, edge of segment, delivery ratios, you may have scenarios where a development above a reservoir has less impact to the Chesapeake Bay from nutrient perspective because that reservoir is a sink than you would if you were right on the Chesapeake Bay. And if you take into account delivery ratios, you could eschew the concept of looking at loading factors. So this is going to be one of the big science questions going forward is, should delivery factors play a role in analyzing this? This pre versus post-development load, there's really a strong impetus for redevelopment and infill. And then to the extent you're farmland, there's questions about whether it should be viewed as corn-soy rotation or whether it should be viewed as pasture, because each one of those has a loading allocation associated with it that'll determine whether you're triggering an obligation to offset. Permanency is something that has been thrown out still for these kind of offsets. Offsets theoretically can't be used until such time as they're installed. So that's another thing. The idea of also in a development dynamic is to build incentives to do as much on-site as possible, so there would be on-site pollution reduction approaches. If you did reforestation and other things on-site as part of a development, you might get credit for that. Then there's off-site pollution reduction practices. And remember the ag certification side, that was ag focus, and they're category 1, 2, and 3. There are a host of urban types of practices that are being worked on as well. Retrofitting stormwater, stream restoration, and the like, that also would be done in the urban context to generate those credits. Credit certification, verification, and transparency, a key component. Regulation of brokers and aggregators, trading geographies, we've talked about that. One other thought is the fee in lieu. There's discussion about that. It's come up to a dollar figure that basically said if you need an offset and offsets aren't available, there would be a fee in lieu dynamic that could be, you pay into the county basically in order to achieve that objective. Credit stacking, and what I mean by credit stacking is this question of, that hasn't been resolved, which is, can I put it in a practice where I can sell nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment separately? Can I sell impervious acres separately? Can I do all of that separately from one practice? That's a policy question. Cross-sector trading, Secretary Grumble's policy laid that out, that basically there's inclination to allow this. And then trading ratios. So those are things out from the stormwater side, but I think the key thing to keep in mind is how these markets differ. So in conclusion, I think one of the things is we've taken a great first step with the MDA regs in December, and that is not insignificant, but we really need to develop the comprehensive water quality trading documents that are going to be forthcoming, and there's major commitments from this administration to do so. There's supposed to be, right now, a very ambitious schedule of saying a final report's supposed to be issued in the spring of 2016 with a conference to be held in mid-2016 addressing this water quality side of the equation. So thanks so much, and look forward to questions if time.